Don't leave the door open. Secure your APIs with the Curity Identity Server. Curity allows you to centralize identity management policies with a solution developed by an expert team using well-established standards. Curity facilitates scalable security for apps and websites by offering a unique combination of identity and access management with API security. Protect your users, secure apps and websites, manage API access. Start your free trial today at securityweekly.com/curity. The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Fortra is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Fortra's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Fortra's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. That's how both our guests today got onto the show, I believe, is starting with that form. All right, for our second interview today, Dan Freckling joins us today to talk about why data privacy is getting overhauled in 2023. Dan is the CEO of Boltive, which makes a product that helps publishers and ad exchanges address invasive and potentially malicious ads. I hope I'm characterizing that correctly.
Yeah, that's right, Adrian. Thanks for that intro.
Right. Dan's been leading B2B SaaS businesses since before the dot-com bubble and was a VP at stamps.com at one point. I found that an interesting tidbit there. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. And thanks for giving me a trip down memory lane just now.
Yeah, that one jumped out at me. Stamps.com. There's got to be a story there from like .com startups to the U.S. Post Office. It's the U.S. Post Office, right?
Yeah, at one point, Stamps.com was a punchline, and then it became wildly successful after I had left. But the thing that changed actually for the company was 9/11 and the anthrax in the mail. And once there was a rebranding of many companies to national security companies, Stamps got swept up in that. Stamps.com did, because they were able to trace mail, and it was a very effective defense against more pathogens, but through the mail system using the unique tracking that was on the Stamps.com printable postage.
Very cool. I did not know that at all. That's very interesting. So talking about privacy today, I guess to get us started, you know, what we just talked about, you had a role at stamps.com. So how do you get to privacy? How do you get over to because you haven't always been in the security world, correct?
Yeah, I haven't been. I sold my last company called G2 to Verisk, and that was kind of adjacent to cybersecurity. That was about bad actors and bad content, illegal e-commerce. But it was really a personal situation. I didn't intend to become a privacy practitioner. I don't have a legal background, but I had an incident that happened to me that really compelled me to do something about privacy. And what happened was one day my wife had back pain. And so we searched to figure out what the causes might be. And after no improvement, we went in for an MRI and we got a very strange diagnosis that it was possible cancer. And that's about the last thing you would have expected. We certainly didn't expect it. And we did more and more tests, and it was confirmed it was non-small cell lung cancer. But it was also very advanced, unfortunately, at stage 4, having spread throughout her body. So I did tons of research, like many people do when you go through the cancer journey, and visited lots of treatment sites, looked for lots of different variations of cancer that it might be. But while I was researching the diagnosis, I was being profiled online, not to my knowledge, based on my browse history. And I started seeing all these shady cancer treatments coming through the internet. And some were new treatments, some were dramatic. But it was really how I learned, having been a marketer, such as my time at stamps.com, I learned the other side and how intrusive and predatory targeted marketing can really be. So having gone through that experience, and one of life's ironies, the founding CEO of Boltive was also going through that same journey with his wife. And my wife sadly passed away, but his Val was still with us, and so he did a very noble thing, and he took time to be a caregiver, and that allowed me to come into the company. He recruited me in to be CEO, and we transitioned at that point. And it's been a real good fit for me because we really are a mission-based business, and privacy is more than just another offshoot of cybersecurity. For many of us, it's a very personal mission about data rights for people and taking back some of those rights that were lost.
Yeah, and it's in security. I think you do. Well, I'm biased, right? I've been in security my whole career, but you do find a lot of mission-oriented folks, where it's more than just a job. Not necessarily with a story like yours, but generally it's touched them in some way personally. Where they just they dove in, they did a bunch of research, and before you know it, it ends up where you live. Because you want to make things better, right?
Yeah, that's really it.
Yeah. So, let's kind of, so since you mentioned Boltive, let's talk a little bit about what Boltive does, because this is not really my area either. There are a lot of categories that are kind of adjacent to security, like anti-fraud, dealing with bots and things like that. But to me, kind of the ad tech industry and how a lot of marketing works behind the scenes, how, I think we've all seen the effects of searching for something online and all of a sudden getting targeted ads related to your browsing habits. And in fact, we even have a story we're going to cover in the news segment today about how Apple, kind of took advantage of people's privacy when they shouldn't have. There's a lawsuit against them for that. But I guess maybe help us understand like what the problem is here. How this I guess a problem in the market that Boltive kind of serves to address.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that what I describe here, I think will lend itself to the Apple story too, in a moment. But it comes down to programmatic advertising. So programmatic advertising is an auction called real-time bidding. And that auction takes place in something like 20 to 50 milliseconds. And while that's happening, it's all algorithmically based, no human intervention. There are buyers and sellers that are matched up. And it's essentially lawless. It's like putting a package in the mail when you are buying an ad and passing through a number of different intermediaries along the way until that package is then opened up on a website and served to a consumer. But the handoffs along the way from the middlemen, they're essentially handling something they don't really know what the material is. So as a result of that, there's a need for a sheriff to help make sure that bad things aren't happening. And that's how Boltive started. Our original name is Ad Lightning, and that's still the name of our anti-malvertising product, which does address malware issues like redirects and malicious browser extensions and Trojans and other things that are delivered through ads. But as we've grown over time, our customers have asked for other solutions. So they've asked for solutions against objectionable ads. We're just exiting the political season, and there's quite a bit of extreme content that makes its way into political campaigns, more so in recent years. And that's undesirable by many online publishers. So our technology can discover malcontent. It can be images that are considered unseemly or not safe for work that we can help block as well. But this area of what I think the politicians like to call surveillance advertising is really a much bigger issue and a much more timely issue. And that's being driven by this year, really, regulations that are being finalized that are coming online next year, starting January 1. And I think you did a very good job back in August with Scott Giordano of Sperian when you talked about the new data privacy laws. That's an excellent episode, and I think it's still worth going back and listening to because there's still a lot of good wisdom in there. But we're here, Boltive is here to help companies because many were scrambling then, back in August. Even more started scrambling after the Sephora announcement, or Sephora settlement, I should say, and more are scrambling now. But I'll make one more comment on Apple. Apple's done a very savvy thing, which is they've built a very privacy safe walled garden around their devices. And what it does is it takes advantage of how the laws are written. So the laws are written really to discourage data sharing between companies, third parties, cross context. Those are some of the terms used. But Apple, being as large and pervasive as it is, can do those ad buying and ad serving and targeting all within a single enterprise. So while the exact same thing is happening, it's not leaving the walls and therefore is lawful. Very clever, very savvy, privacy supportive, but also very lucrative too.
Sure.
Is that why we're seeing with the American Data Privacy Protection Act proposal, the big tech companies not making more noise about it for the reason you just mentioned?
Yeah, there is an outcome where privacy regulations like the ADPPA make the big tech companies more powerful because they essentially sidestep the provisions that affect the smaller players in the ecosystem that are forced to share in order to be viable advertising channels. Whereas the big players, the big tech, will win because they can be privacy compliant and they have massive amounts of inventory. When you look at what Google and what Meta and what TikTok has, Amazon has, they're in Apple, of course, they're the players that will get stronger if privacy regulations don't take that into account.
Why isn't this talked about more? The US definitely falls behind other countries on privacy. Why do you think there is such reluctance to, well, I think I know the answer. It's one word, consumerism, but or capitalism, but why do you think there's such acceptance on the part of the consumer to accept privacy violations? So just a couple of hours ago, I accidentally clicked on an ad. I have a hurt finger and my clicking finger is not working very well, and I accidentally clicked on an ad. Within seconds, I received an ad to my email with a promotional discount to a company that I never meant to even interact with, which felt like a huge privacy violation. I was furious. There's nothing I can do about it. Horse is out of the barn. I can write to my Congress people, I can do all I want, but I'm not a big voice here. And there aren't a lot of people like me. So why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think you said it, sort of unfettered capitalism and sort of getting used to a world over time, like the water being turned up, boiling a frog. But it does reach a breaking point. I think if you go back in history, it's very interesting to watch the confluence of two trends. One is the origin of the kind of tracking that you mentioned and being profiled and served ads. And the other is the origin of data protection. And when the internet started, it was a frontier that was lawless. I mean, it was accepted in, I remember from the beginning of the era that Adrian fondly caused me to remember at stamps.com, that it was accepted that much of the internet was outside the jurisdiction of law. Things just happened. It was a Wild West. And so you had the origin of the cookie, which, if you go back in the beginning of the internet, people used to browse cars by going to auto pages on Yahoo and MSN and AOL, some of those names, and car makers placed their ads there. Then one day Google appears, and now people are searching for content, and the audience fragments. And advertisers then have to work with all these intermediaries to reach that audience that used to be centralized on the big portals. And the origin of the cookie was you could know who had visited sites, not at that moment, but who had visited those sites before. And back to the unfettered capitalism, that's a holy grail. That's massively valuable to be able to know people that are auto intenders because they had visited certain sites in the past 30 days. And so, and that over time just became more and more like the water, being turned up on the stove. It became more and more pervasive. You had interest-based advertising. And then in 2007, which was really iPhone dawn of the multi-device era, you have cross-app advertising, which is like the mobile equivalent of the retargeting that we used to see just on the web. And then over time, you had device graphs that could connect your phone, your desktop, even later your connected TV, and know that you're the same person, and even cross-device hit you up with those ads. So that's kind of the progression of online tracking. Then at the same time, we had this other thing going on, mostly outside the US, which was around, it was sort of the drumbeat of data protection. It began, I think, in Europe. Europe has a history, of course, of data privacy violations that have had horrendous consequences. But UK newspapers were engaged in this hacking scandal back in the early 2000s, where people's information were published in Rupert Murdoch's newspapers. We didn't start to see this in the US really until Edward Snowden and the leaking of NSA classified information. Then we started to wake up, but again, not as far along as the rest of the world. And it wasn't until Equifax and Cambridge Analytica and these other things grew that the first US privacy law, which was a CCPA out of California, was passed in 2018. But more importantly, you had GDPR in Europe, which was this great collision where GDPR said enough is enough, that the data tracking has gone too far. We need more data protection. And since it's been a whole different world, if you think of the eras of the internet, it's been a different era post 2018.
Yeah. So let's see. Trying to think of where to pick up here. So, going back to kind of the foundation here, I want to get an idea for, you're talking about how these ads get auctioned, and it's all fully automated. Like I've got to imagine that different websites or the mechanism that's used to do the platforms that are used to do the auctioning, the ad tech companies, there's got to be some kind of content or policy. Well, I say there's got to be, right? Like, I know I might be disappointed by your answer here, but what is the current state of the market? Is it still very much Wild West, where somebody has like a EULA or something like that, says the ads can't fit into any of these categories, and people just ignore it, and all kinds of stuff gets blasted out? Or where is the industry in terms of companies having something like your product? Or like, I would think that the ad techs, like these auctioning platforms, would have this built in.
This is an ecosystem that resists contracts. And it's very much how can you get dozens and dozens of intermediaries to work together and solve a very, very difficult problem, which is, if I'm an advertiser and I want to advertise on the internet, where should I go and who should I reach and how often should I run these? It's a very, very hard problem to solve. And so the notion of terms of service or EULAs to say, let's solve this problem, but please don't send me these kinds of ads and these kinds of ads and those kinds of ads. Those can be done with direct buys, but with programmatic, there's just not really a control mechanism for that. It's all happening so fast, and there's so many buyers and sellers and so much volume going through. So what you see in the California laws, though, are the encouraging of contracts and the notion of defining service providers, contractors, and third parties. And those are three types of vendors that have very, very different legal implications in California. But you must have contracts with those three parties in order to do business with them. And that's to solve the data protection problem, not the content problem. The content problem, I believe, would need to be solved similar to like a Digital Services Act, like in Europe, coming to the US, which would be repealing Section 230, right? In the Section 230 in the Communications Code basically says, as a platform, you're hands off with regard to user-generated abhorrent content. That's not your fault. But that's the sort of, again, I'm not a lawyer, so lawyers listening on this episode may have more to say. But that framework, again, the sort of consumers' willingness up until recently to allow privacy violations, and the legal framework of competition before consumer protection in a lot of the way the laws are written, it means that you're in this lawless world, Adrian, and EULAs in terms of service will do their best, but the technology moves faster than that.
Wow. Yeah, and mentioning lawyers talking about this, you referenced the episode we had with Scott Giordano. For folks listening or watching, that is episode 285. If you look for episode 285 or just search Scott Giordano's name on YouTube, you'll find that episode where he talks about these 5 new laws going in. And the one of those that we're going to touch on today is California's law, because as we all know, California tends to be ahead of the curve here, and they're a large enough state with enough people and companies headquartered in California that they can have a really big impact, almost the same level impact as like a federal statute in some cases. But I believe this is called, so when Scott was on, you'll hear him refer to it as CPRA. But I've come to learn from Dan that what we're talking about today is CCPA, which is like a patch for CPRA, because CPRA didn't work. Is that about right?
Actually, it's close. Yeah, we are talking about CCPA, and CPRA is actually the patch. But I got it. But there's no right answer, right? There's a school of thought that said, let's just call the whole thing CPRA now, because that's the new ballot initiative that was passed in California. And then there's another group that's maybe more purist that says, well, no, it's really amending CCPA, so we're going to keep calling it CCPA. But that's the thing, and the rulemaking is still ongoing with that. The law takes effect January 1, and enforcement takes effect July 1. So it's not a whole lot of time for companies to get ready.
So what you mentioned Sephora. So what happened with Sephora here? If enforcement hasn't happened yet, what are they getting hit with here, and why?
Yeah. Enforcement of the CPRA takes effect January 1. Enforcement of CCPA has been ongoing for years now. What was different about Sephora was it was the first settlement where a fine was paid. And there were hundreds of letters that the Attorney General's office sent out, letters of noncompliance. And companies would make corrections within a 30-day statutory cure period. They had 30 days to fix their act. Almost all companies did that, and so avoided more severe consequences. Well, 2 things. 1, Sephora didn't, allegedly. And number 2, that 30-day cure goes away January 1, so there isn't a warning shot anymore. But let's talk about what happened with Sephora that was claimed. And I'll say that this was in the context soon before the elections, and the Attorney General's office is an elected office. And the words around this were very serious by Attorney General Bonta. The gloves are coming off, and they're getting very serious in the Attorney General's office of California about companies that are skirting the law. But what happened was it ended up being a settlement for $1.2 million for violations of CCPA, and which makes it the first fine. It's not a very large fine in the scheme of things, but recall the first GDPR fine was around $250,000, and it reached a peak of $800 million to Amazon last year. But what was at stake here for Sephora was the Attorney General alleged that Sephora did not honor opt-outs from a certain form of signal called the global privacy control, which is like the latter-day version of do not track on your browser. It's a browser plugin or inherent to certain browsers that tells the world, do not track me. And Sephora, like many companies, in fact, like 90% of companies, don't have a way to honor that signal. What else happened was data was shared with third parties through an online analytics vendor, and that was not named, but some have suggested it might have been Google Analytics. And that was allowing consumer data to leave Sephora and be shared with a third party without Sephora disclosing that it was sharing or really selling that data in their privacy policies. Those were the issues.
That's interesting. Was it intentional or oops, it leaked? Hopefully you get in trouble either way. Again, to reference another story we're going to talk about in the news, there was an attempt to call some cryptocurrency going missing a hack, where everybody looking at it's like, nah, they're just they're trying to get funds out of the reach of regulators.
It's not a field I have that much experience in, but I would feel like the odds of accidentally sharing that type of data is actually much higher than the odds of accidentally sending cryptocurrency into the void. I've seen it in the past. People do end up using something like Google Analytics in places where no one thinks about it. It gets inserted, and then 3 years later, you've got so much data in there that you didn't even know about. So, do you think it's likely that a lot of these are accidental just because people don't really know,
Yes.
and then the data piles up? And
you described it perfectly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That is exactly what happens. That it's no ill intent. I mean, Sephora just wanted to find more customers, and they were trying to find lookalike audiences. It was not malicious. It's actually good business, but it's still a violation. And it's a mistake that many, many companies, most companies that are marketing today are making the exact same mistake. So it's not ill intent. And what you described, the reason I chuckled is that this is often how it happens. You have a project and someone puts a pixel or a beacon on a web page, and there's no governance around that. And this might have been last summer with an intern. It might have been 5 years ago, but it's still sitting there. And now the laws have changed, and now you can't do that anymore. So it's, with a lot of data privacy, the first thing you've got to do is your data mapping. And people think about databases and where is my data stored and what kind of structured and unstructured data do I have in which database. But then all the while, there's this problem of these pixels and beacons and tags sitting on web pages, which are seemingly pretty innocuous. And that's where the leaks of consumer data are going. And that's where you're getting in trouble. So Sephora, I should have mentioned, is also under a 2-year injunction where they have to report back all their privacy incidents to California and how to solve those. But it's exactly that. It's often inadvertent. It could have been anybody. It happened to be Sephora, and it happened to be Sephora didn't remedy it in the dirty days that they were asked to.
So talk a bit about how you guys do what you do, because it was not what I was expecting. I think it's interesting how your products work, how you find these kinds of leaks.
Yeah, because of our origin in anti-malware, we have created and patented a way of looking at that activity that's different than most. And we called it, in this case, secret shoppers for privacy. So we create synthetic users, and it's simulated data. So whenever something wrongly happens to these, there's no laws being broken. It's imitation. But it allows us to smoke test the internet pipes in a very effective way. Like a smoke test, you would push smoke through a pipe before you would push a flammable gas. But that smoke tells you exactly where the leaks are, and you know how to repair it. So then when the gas goes through, you're safe. Same idea. We will apply these personas, and they will visit sites. They will go through the customer journey. They will visit things. They will browse things. They will put things in their shopping cart. They will opt out of data sharing. Some will opt into data sharing. And we record all the forensics of everything that's happening to these synthetic users so that we can know if systems are working properly. And it persists over time. So these users will have a lifetime. And so days, weeks, even months after they've taken on activities, we can watch, is that data leaking still? Are ads being served that shouldn't be served because the consumer opted out? And again, timestamp all of this and have a trail of everything that's happening. So it's the sort of thing that you could do with analysts, but it would be extraordinarily expensive and time consuming. And because we can create any number of these personas, they can operate at different speeds, we can get results faster. But that's really the notion.
Yeah, it's funny. You're talking about the smoke test and using made up data, using synthetic data. And immediately where my brain went was, maybe that's what Todd Davis, the CEO of LifeLock, should have done instead of using his own social security number in all those advertisements back in the day. I don't know if anybody here remembers that, but.
Oh yeah, I absolutely do. But I thought what you were going to bring up is this is actually similar to some of the like honeypot techniques, right? Like things like canary tokens and honey
Yes.
users and all of that, but brought to the advertising environment, which
Right.
it's a more long-term thing, right? Like you can't just do things over a short period of time. You said you watch things over a month. And how much of your engineering is focused on like generating that believable user activity and then track it? How do you detect that something is leaked? Do you deal with data brokers and try to see if you can buy these things, or how does that work?
We will observe how the data is leaking because of the marketing that's directed towards the personas. And we will have test and control personas of different stripes. We'll have the opt-in, we'll have the opt-out. and then we have a third control. So we can see for someone who never engaged with a certain brand, what is their ad experience? Because sometimes you'll see ads from companies you've never visited because of generalized contextual advertising. But we can statistically determine the likelihood when an opt-out consumer sees a certain number of ads in a certain period of time, how likely is it that data is leaking to them? We can also observe communications from the browser also. So that allows us to see which parties are engaged. And this is through the benefit of some standards, some internet standards like the TCF, Transparency and Consent Framework, and the US privacy string, and different strings in Europe. But there are these other standards out there that allow us to kind of more quickly see when consent is dropped.
That's awesome. So it's a scientific version of feeling weird about suddenly seeing a bunch of ads for shoes when you were just doing something on a website, but then you never know, is that a coincidence? But if you do it at scale and often enough, you can prove that it is not a coincidence. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and at least it calls to suspicion. And because we can see the nodes where it happened, you can investigate and find where sometimes, we have examples of patches that were put and deployed out on different internet intermediaries, and those patches undid the privacy compliance unknowingly because it wasn't part of the regression testing. Those kinds of things happen all the time. Again, innocuous, but you wouldn't see it unless you had the ability at scale to see lots of user experiences.
And
So
where do you run the infrastructure for that? I guess in some cases, do you need to be coming out from like IP addresses that are realistic? Do you have to use like residential IPs, or are you doing all this from a cloud? Or
it's both. Yeah, we do cloud, residential, different situations for different needs. But you're right, because the theme is you have to look and act as much as a real consumer would. And anything short of that, and you can be blocked, and the interactions won't happen, and you won't get a read on what's really going on.
So let me get this right. Like, because the ad tech companies aren't blocking malicious stuff, you have to be like there's. It sounds almost like they're spending more time on blocking you from blocking the bad stuff than actually blocking the bad stuff in the first place, which is what they should have been doing in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's, if you're running a retail business and you have had price scrapers hitting your site thousands and thousands of times a day, that's maybe your first pain before you think about privacy. Is what about my own data as a business? I don't want that going out there so competitors can undercut my prices, and the price bots that are out there. So the business need steered companies towards let's avoid those scrapers from hitting our sites. Let's optimize for that. Now privacy comes along, and it's less dollars and cents, although we see ROI every day on this problem. It's a little bit more nuanced. What's very interesting about privacy and consent is it's not just a compliance problem. It's really a targeting problem. And what we discover with our systems when there are errors like this, what we call dark signals, that is when an opt-out consumer actually looks like they've opted in, or when an opt-in consumer looks like they've actually opted out, which is actually a more frequent problem. That's not just a compliance issue. That's a revenue issue. Opt-in consumers who raise their hands and say, go ahead and target me, those are your most lucrative prospects. And when you can't see who they are because of the technical handoffs and errors and disruptions that we see all the time, then as a publisher, you're leaving revenue on the table. As an advertiser, you're missing your most responsive audience. So I go back and this problem that we're solving, it gets wrapped up in privacy, but it's really at its core, it's a targeting blindness that leads to this in the first place.
Right. Any other questions, Katie?
I just had one. It's a little tangential, but in terms of privacy and privacy management, there are some companies who are getting pretty serious about it. And with some of the laws that are in place, some of the ones that will hopefully be coming up, it necessitates that companies have processes and tools to be able to know where all of their data related to a data subject are. And that's super problematic. So how do you work, or do you work now, or what are your plans to work with companies like, the data mapping, data identification, like the OneTrusts of the world, if you're familiar with them. The companies that can go out and find, if I'm Katie Teitler and I work with company A and company A has 762 repositories with my data in it, they don't know where all of that data is, and it would take weeks or even months to find it. So how do you work with those companies, or what is your stance on that?
Yeah, that's a different thing than we do. So we partner with companies that are really good at data mapping, really good at inventorying the data, really good at mapping and tracking data flows, and then governing those data flows. There's a lot of great technology that's been built. OneTrust is one, but there's many others that are very competitive and have innovations that OneTrust doesn't have. And those are our potential partners. They figure out the data sprawl problem, and we figure out the diagnosis and the validation. So the diagnosis being, let's run our scans and let's see where the synthetic personas are finding problems and pinpoint where those are. Then these other technologies that you're describing, let's remedy those, and then let's validate everything's been fixed by running it again. The thing to remember, though, is vendors are changing all the time, and errors are being introduced, sometimes on a day-to-day basis. So it's not enough to audit once a year. That will get you in trouble with the regulators. The auditing really needs to be ongoing, but that's our role, more the monitoring and auditing, which is a naturally, like, you don't want the fox guarding the hen house. It's natural to have a different company do the discovery and the auditing than it is to have the company that's actually performing the service. So it's kind of a natural break in there and a good partnership.
Yeah, it sounds like it. A few years ago I learned about them, and I was a big fan of that technology. So it's great that you have that natural partnership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Dan, what do companies need to do to prepare? Well, obviously with Sephora, they're past the deadline for some of the stuff that they need to do. But I guess, two-part question. Where do you see the most gaps in what companies haven't done yet? It sounds like that, some of the data requests, some of the, the right to be forgotten type stuff, having these processes and procedures in place might be part of it. And what should companies be doing? Like, I assume there's services, there's companies you can hire to come in and do like a gap analysis on what you need to do to comply with this stuff. But what should companies be doing between now and January 1st or just now?
Yeah, I think it starts something. If you look back and rewind the clock to May of 2018 when GDPR took effect, European companies weren't fully ready for that. And that's okay. The regulators didn't expect perfection, but they expected good faith efforts and a start. I don't think we're at a point where we can run a report card on most companies and see how mature they are, because so few companies have buttoned up the way they need to. And that's okay. There's going to be some forgiveness. But number one, you have to assign a leader for your data privacy program in one way or another. Under GDPR, you need to have a data protection officer. That's not required under California. Yeah, right, exactly. Not required under the national law, the ADPPA, but it's a good idea. And then engaging in the data mapping, right? There's a good NIST privacy framework around how to do data mapping through inventory and data flow. Lots of companies that can do that. That's a next step. Then I would say implementing systems to prevent what we call dark signals and data skimmers. So dark signals are when these transmissions of consent and data between handoffs between vendors break, are mistranslated, and data leaks out. Those dark signals are a menace. The second thing is data skimmers. We didn't get much of a chance to talk about this, but the problem with this data leakage it's not just that the big technology companies are going to see it. There's actually some bad actors lurking in there. We see malware distributors in the bid stream that are profiling consumers and taking that consumer data. We have even seen companies that are sanctioned companies in unfriendly foreign countries that are getting US consumer data, because this is a really massive ecosystem. And you're not talking just about third parties, but fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh parties, the vendors of vendors of vendors that are out there. So identifying who those data skimmers are is a very, very important step, because that's where it becomes dangerous. So I would think the first thing is to do something, assign someone, begin the data mapping process, and then where Boltive comes in are these systems for the transmissions between vendors to make sure that's operating properly and that there are no holes or data leakage there.
Guillaume
And
had
I
the
had
perfect wrap question for you. Yeah, go ahead, Guillaume.
Just a quick question. Do you run an ad blocker? And if so, which one is your favorite?
We don't. We partner with ad blockers. Or I should say, we are open to partnering with ad blockers, because that ad blockers can do a good thing for consumers, but they can do a bad thing for publishers. A lot of the advertising we're describing here is what funds the open web, and without the advertising and even some of the overreach and infractions that we're talking about, without this money being available and being funded by advertisers, many of the websites we love would disappear behind paywalls. Right.
Yeah.
So ad blockers have a role, and ad blockers have a role. They're all trying to do the right thing in different ways. But I guess I would leave that one point, is that if we go too far, if the pendulum swings too far, we're going to end up in a world like where the internet began, which is you have CompuServe and AOL and these walled gardens that control everything, because there's not enough money for the smaller players to survive, because the ad dollars disappear due to privacy excessiveness.
Yeah, too much regulation as well.
Yeah.
How do you personally handle the, that dilemma? Do you so you don't use blockers for anything, or anything like Brave?
I do. I do think that there's room for privacy safe browsers like Brave, Ghost Read Dawn. Firefox is good at this. If you're not on any of those, deleting your unused browser extensions, I think is a good idea. It's using search engines like DuckDuckGo that don't track you, using all the switching on all of the protections on your mobile device, iOS, turning off app tracking and so forth, using anonymized email. You can go on and on and on. I will tell you personally, I don't turn too much of it off, because I'm curious what kind of targeted advertising I'm going to get. I kind of need to know that. So I'm out there like the average consumer.
No, that's a really good answer. And to be honest, I don't know how they do things different, but Facebook and Instagram, so Facebook's products, have the best targeted ads. Like they really do know me, and they pitch me stuff, and like I'll publicly give them kudos. Like I've bought several products. In fact, those are the only products I can think of where I've actually bought stuff from ads, directly from ads. Most of the other ones that I interact with get it wrong. I think we talked about this in the prep call. Like I'll often get ads for things that I just bought, and it's the kind of thing where you're only going to buy, one at least for a given amount of time, like an appliance or a car or something like that.
You don't collect battery chargers?
Right. like you're wasting all your money. I mean, yes, I looked at this thing, but there should be some way for the advertiser to know that I pulled the trigger on it and I actually bought it. So there's no sense in advertising to me what I just got.
Happens all the time.
It kills me. It kills me. It just seems. Well, and to your point, I do like to see that. I like to see, okay, ad tech for all the AI and ML and talk that they have, it looks pretty dumb. It's just kind of shotgun blasted, right?
It is. Yeah, it is entertaining.
Yeah. Well, Dan, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. Great conversation. I loved it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adrian. And if you want to find out more about us, we're at boltive.com.
Oh, yeah. And I should mention in the show notes, you generously provided a bunch of links if people want to read more about this, whether you want to read about the legal side, the privacy laws, or more about data leakage and things like that. A lot of great, one from Consumer Reports, a lot of great resources here in the show notes.
Yeah, and if you want to talk shop, anybody, I love to geek out on this stuff. Hit me up on LinkedIn also. There is a thriving privacy community on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And we'll be back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.